Hey there, language learners, and welcome back to another exciting episode of Learn English with Podcast. I'm your host, Nikki, and as always, I'm joined by my awesome friend, Tony. How are you doing today, Tony?
Hey, Nikki. I'm doing fantastic, especially because we've got such a fun topic lined up for our listeners today.
That's right, Tony. Today, we're delving into a topic that's not only relatable, but also oh so fun to talk about. Best excuses. We've all been there, haven't we?
That moment when you're running late and scrambling to come up with a believable excuse, or when you just can't face that phone call you've been dreading.
Well, fear not, because today we're going to explore the art of excuse making and how it can actually help you improve your English skills.
Absolutely, Nikki. Excuses aren't just about getting out of trouble. They're also a great way to practice your language skills. Whether it's crafting a convincing lie or simply explaining why you couldn't finish your homework, excuses require creativity and language finesse.
And let's not forget the humor, Tony. Excuses often lead to some pretty hilarious situations, and we're definitely going to share some laughs along the way.
Definitely. So, whether you're a beginner just starting out on your English learning journey or a seasoned pro looking to brush up on your skills, this episode is for you. Get ready to laugh, learn, and maybe even come up with a few excuses of your own.
All right, listeners, let's dive right into our discussion about excuses. Tony, what's your take on the importance of excuses when it comes to learning English?
Well, Nikki, excuses are like little language puzzles. You have to think on your feet, choose the right words, and put them together in a way that makes sense. It's a great way to practice vocabulary, grammar, and even pronunciation in real-life situations.
Absolutely. And you know what they say, practice makes perfect. So, the more you use English to come up with excuses, the more confident and proficient you'll become.
That's right, Nikki. And let's not forget about cultural nuances. Excuses can vary from one country to another, so understanding how different cultures approach excuse making can really broaden your language skills.
Spot on, Tony. And hey, speaking of cultural differences, do you remember that time we were both late to that dinner party and had to come up with excuses on the spot?
Oh, how could I forget? We were like a comedy duo, trying to outdo each other with our excuses. I think we ended up blaming it on traffic and a sudden rainstorm, right?
That's right. And our friends bought it hook, line, and sinker. It just goes to show that a little creativity goes a long way when it comes to excuses.
Absolutely. And hey, speaking of creativity, I think it's time we introduce our first guest who has a hilarious excuse story to share. Listeners, please give a warm welcome to our friend Sarah. Sarah, tell us a bit about yourself and your excuse story.
Hi, Nikki and Tony. Thanks for having me. Well, my excuse story takes place back in college when I completely forgot about a group project deadline. I panicked and came up with the craziest excuse ever to get out of trouble.
Oh, we can't wait to hear it, Sarah! But before we dive into your story, let's unpack a bit. Tony, what are your initial thoughts on Sarah's predicament?
Well, Nikki, forgetting about a group project deadline is definitely a tough spot to be in. But hey, we've all been there, right? It'll be interesting to see how Sarah managed to wriggle her way out of that one. All right, Sarah, spill the beans. What was this crazy excuse you came up with to avoid the consequences of missing that group project deadline?
Well, Tony, let me set the scene for you. It was the night before the deadline, and I realized I hadn't even started on my part of the project. Panic mode activated. So, instead of owning up to my mistake, I decided to blame it all on my pet iguana.
Your pet iguana? That's a new one! Please, do tell us more.
Yes, Tony, my pet iguana. I told my professor that my beloved reptilian friend had fallen ill suddenly, and I had to rush him to the vet. Of course, I made sure to add plenty of dramatic details to make it sound convincing.
Wow, Sarah, that's quite the elaborate excuse. Did your professor buy it?
Surprisingly, yes. I think the sheer audacity of the excuse caught him off guard, and he ended up giving me an extension on the project deadline.
That's incredible. But hey, I have to ask, do you even have a pet iguana?
No, Tony, I don't. That was just part of the creative storytelling. But hey, it worked like a charm.
It definitely did. And you know what, Sarah? Your story just goes to show how a little imagination and quick thinking can save the day. Plus, you probably learned a ton of new vocabulary and expressions while crafting that excuse.
Absolutely, Mickey. It was like a crash course in creative storytelling and problem solving, all rolled into one.
Well, Sarah, thanks for sharing your hilarious excuse story with us. It's been a blast hearing about your adventures in the world of creative fibbing.
Definitely. And listeners, don't go anywhere, because we've got more exciting excuse stories coming your way. But first, let's take a quick break to hear a joke related to our topic. Tony, got one for us.
Of course, Nikki. Here it is. Why did the student bring a ladder to class?
I'm not sure, Tony. Why?
Because they heard the class was going to be on a high level. Get it? High level? Like climbing a ladder?
Ha ha ha, that's a good one, Tony. I love how you always tie our jokes back to our topic.
All right, listeners, keep those chuckles coming as we dive back into our discussion about excuses.
Welcome back, everyone. We hope you enjoyed that little moment of laughter. Now, let's jump right back into our exploration of excuses and how they can help us improve our English skills.
Absolutely, Nikki. So, listeners, have you ever found yourself in a situation where you had to come up with a clever excuse to avoid something?
Maybe it was a phone call you didn't want to answer, or perhaps you needed to explain why you were late for a meeting. Whatever the case may be, excuses are a universal experience, and they can provide valuable opportunities to practice your English.
That's right, Nikki. And you know what? Excuses are not just about avoiding trouble. They can also be a way to build connections and empathy with others. When you're able to explain your situation clearly and respectfully, it shows that you value communication and understanding.
Absolutely, Tony. And speaking of understanding, let's welcome our next guest, Jake, who has a story about using excuses to avoid an awkward situation. Jake, tell us a bit about yourself and your excuse adventure.
Hey, Nikki and Tony. Thanks for having me on the show. So, my excuse story takes place at a family gathering where I desperately needed a way out of a conversation with my nosy aunt.
Oh, we can't wait to hear it, Jake. But before we dive into your story, Tony, what are your initial thoughts on Jake's predicament?
Well, Nikki, dealing with nosy relatives can be a challenge, that's for sure. But hey, it sounds like Jake found a creative way to navigate that situation. I'm curious to hear how he pulled it off.
Me too, Tony. All right, Jake, let's hear it. How did you manage to escape the clutches of your nosy aunt with a clever excuse?
Well, Nikki, it was a classic family gathering scenario. My aunt was bombarding me with questions about my personal life, and I just needed a way out. So I pretended to receive an urgent phone call and excused myself to take it outside.
Smooth move, Jake. That's a classic excuse right there. Did your aunt buy it?
Surprisingly, yes. I think she was too caught up in her own curiosity to question it too much. But hey, it gave me some much-needed breathing room, so I'm not complaining.
Well, Jake, you definitely mastered the art of excuse making in that moment. And you know what? Your story just goes to show that sometimes a little white lie can save the day.
Absolutely. And listeners, we hope you've enjoyed hearing these excuse adventures as much as we have. Remember, excuses aren't just about getting out of trouble. They're also a valuable opportunity to practice your English skills in real-life situations.
That's right, Tony. And hey, speaking of real-life situations, we've got one more guest who's eager to share their own excuse story with us. Listeners, please welcome our final guest, Lisa. Lisa, tell us a bit about yourself and your excuse adventure.
Hi, Nikki and Tony. Thanks for having me on the show. Well, my excuse story takes place at work when I had to come up with a creative way to avoid a meeting with my boss.
Oh, we can't wait to hear it, Lisa. But before we dive into your story, Tony, what are your initial thoughts on Lisa's predicament?
Well, Nikki, dodging a meeting with the boss sounds like a tricky situation indeed. I'm curious to hear how Lisa managed to pull it off without raising any suspicion.
Me too, Tony. All right, Lisa, get ready to spill the beans on your excuse adventure. We're all ears.
Well, Nikki and Tony, it was one of those days at work where everything seemed to be going wrong. Deadlines were looming, and I was feeling overwhelmed. When I saw an invitation to a last-minute meeting with my boss, I knew I had to act fast. So, I came up with an excuse to avoid it.
Oh, the suspense. What was your excuse, Lisa?
I told my boss that I had a sudden family emergency and needed to leave the office immediately. It was a bit nerve-wracking to lie to my boss, but I felt like I had no choice.
That sounds like a high-pressure situation, Lisa. Did your boss buy your excuse?
Surprisingly, yes. I think my frantic demeanor and urgency convinced him that it was a legitimate emergency. It bought me some time to regroup and tackle my work without the added stress of a meeting.
Wow, Lisa, that's quite the tale. It just goes to show how creative thinking and quick decision-making can help in tricky situations. And hey, we're glad everything turned out okay in the end.
Absolutely. And listeners, we hope you enjoyed hearing about Lisa's excuse adventure as much as we did. It's a reminder that sometimes we have to think on our feet and come up with solutions, even if they involve a little white lie. Before we wrap up, let's take a moment to review the key words we've learned today and make sure we understand them thoroughly.
Absolutely, Tony. So, let's start with the first word, excuse. An excuse is an explanation or reason given to justify a fault or offense. For example, I was late to class because I missed the bus. It's not an excuse, just the truth.
That's right, Nikki. And the second word is predicament. A predicament is a difficult or unpleasant situation. Picture this. I found myself in a predicament when I realized I forgot my wallet at home.
Next up, we have finesse. Finesse refers to skillful, delicate handling of a situation. Think of it like this. She handled the difficult conversation with finesse, leaving everyone impressed.
Now, let's talk about audacity. Audacity is boldness or daring, often in a challenging or disrespectful way. For instance, I can't believe she had the audacity to ask for a raise after just a month on the job.
Moving on to nosy. Nosy describes someone who is overly curious or intrusive into others' affairs. You might say, my nosy neighbor is always peeking over the fence to see what I'm up to.
Now, let's talk about urgent. Urgent means requiring immediate action or attention. An example sentence could be, I received an urgent phone call and had to leave the meeting immediately.
And finally, let's discuss regroup. To regroup means to gather together again in order to plan or reassess. For example, after the meeting, we regroup to discuss our next steps.
So there you have it, listeners. 7 words to add to your vocabulary arsenal, each with its own unique meaning and usage. Understanding these words will not only improve your English skills but also enrich your communication abilities.
And with that, we've come to the end of today's episode. We hope you found this vocabulary review helpful and that you're feeling more confident in using these words in your everyday conversations.
Absolutely. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a like if you enjoyed today's content. Your support means the world to us and helps us continue creating valuable learning resources for you.
That's right. So, until next time, keep practicing those English skills and remember, when it comes to excuses, a little creativity goes a long way.